The Cure of Ars. Chapter 9. Victory. Never in his whole pastoral career did the Abbé Vianney find himself with time on his hands, even in the first 2 years of his ministry, when there was in appearance so little for him to do. He discovered constant outlets for his burning zeal, and the hours he devoted to penance and prayer must surely be considered, not only as excellently spent, but as among the best and the most fruitful of his career. In 1820, he decided to provide the church with a real belfry. Since the demolition of the old one, the parishioners had confined themselves to rigging up above the choir 4 beams surmounted by a crossbeam, from which hung the single bell, the dove which had been presented by Mille de Ars and her brother the Viscount. A brick tower, squat and square, was soon erected, while a subsequent list was passed from hand to hand in the village, and the Abbé Vianney heading the names with his own. The subscription brought in a total of 265 francs. The lady of the manor provided a good part of the materials, direct, and the budget of the village council covered the rest of the debt, so that for the sum of 1,106 francs Ars had a new clock tower. In it the dove was hung, and alongside it the chaplain, the very same year, installed at his own expense the bell of the Holy Rosary. While the belfry was going up, the Abbé Vianney opened a little side chapel in the church itself, next door to the sacristy. Blessed on August 6th, the feast day of St. Sixtus, the patron saint of Ars, it was dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. The next task was the restoration of the roof of the nave, and then came the construction of the second chapel, dedicated to St. John the Baptist. The Abbé Vianney had a special love for the forerunner. He had chosen this great preacher of repentance as his patron at his confirmation, and since then he had habitually signed himself Jean-Marie Baptiste Vianney. It was in this chapel, built at his own expense, and solemnly inaugurated on June 24, 1823, that the Cure de Ars established his confessional. The place was soon to become famous, and to be witness to 1,001 wonders. The other 3 side chapels, which are still honored in the village church to our day, the chapel of St. Philomena, the chapel of the Ecce Homo, and the chapel of the Holy Angels, were only built much later. The fact that he was building did not prevent the Abbé Vianney from replenishing what he called, with a charming simplicity, God's wardrobe. He dreamed of sumptuous chasubles and copes, and elaborate sacred vessels, of marble altars, and of fine sculptures, in order that the rejuvenated church might be the scene of solemnities whose beauty should make them even more moving. Unfortunately, he had ruined himself in stone and mortar, and there was nothing to be hoped from a fresh subscription list, for the crops had been more than poor. Help was to come to him from Paris. Though Viscount François Garnier des Garrettes de Ars spent his life almost entirely in the Parisian parish of Saint Sulpice, he had never completely lost interest in the village where he had his mother and his family domains. The dowager Countess des Garrettes had become, in 1808, patron of the former living of Ars, and she was eager for a titular cure to be placed there, and for the village, which had remained a commune, to become a parish again. The Viscount, for his part, did not waste his time in the capital. He employed it so well, indeed, that a royal decree of June 20th, 1821, separated the chaplaincy of Ars from the parish of Miserou. With its independence, Ars recovered its title of parish. We have no evidence to show whether the Abbé Vianney was pleased with this change, which gave him a step up in status. Everything goes to show that he was far happier over the superb presents that followed it. In the spring of 1819, the Viscount had spent a few weeks' holiday in the family chateau, and he returned to Paris filled with the loveliest admiration for the Abbé Vianney. He was determined to help him with his plans, and in particular to finish the embellishment of the interior of the church. From 1823 to 1828, a whole succession of gifts were to arrive from the capital, filling the hearts of the curé and his parishioners with delight. There were splendid banners of silk embroidered with silver, magnificent vestments in silk, in velvet, and in cloth of gold, a canopy of garnet red silk embroidered with gold, which, it was true, was too big to get through the west door, but which was to oblige the generous Viscount to widen it by the 8 feet and give it a new facade. Then there were beautiful reliquaries for the chapels of Our Lady and St. John the Baptist, a silver gilt monstrance, and a dome and tabernacle in gilded copper for the high altar. It was a pleasure to see the Curé de Ars as each new consignment arrived. He laughed and cried by turns as the wonders dispatched from Paris were unpacked. One day a big case was being opened in front of the presbytery when a good old woman happened to pass through the square. "Mother," said the Abbé Vianney, calling to her, "come here, mother, and see something beautiful before you die." It was not only the church of stones and mortar the curé was enriching, with his spirit of urging it on and transforming, just as sweeping was taking place in the souls of the people of Ars. It began as all the big things begin, in a small way. Little groups of girls were its grain of mustard seeds. The Abbé Vianney had noticed them on Sunday evening in 1818, staying on in church after vespers while their companions were dancing in the square, and he invited them into his garden, which he almost never visited himself, to eat currants. "I took the liberty of following them," relates Catherine Lassagne, who was soon to be the right hand of her parish priest, and who was then only 12, "and the curé stayed with us for a few moments. I remember him saying, 'Aren't you happier than the girls who are dancing in the square?' Then he took us into the presbytery, into the kitchen, where he read us the life of my patron saint, and then he talked to us about God. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, just a quiet chat in a stone-flagged kitchen, but the little handful of girls had grasped the essentials of the simple words they had heard. With the least possible fuss or talk, they started spreading the light about them by the mere force of their good example. For them and for the friends they brought in, the Abbé Vianney revived on February 23rd, 1820, the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary, which had done so much good before the Revolution. The next thing was to train up a similar elite among the men. Paradoxically enough, though the confraternities of women had all disappeared in the days of the Terror, the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament, which was designed for men and youths, had not completely broken up. As the Abbé Vianney discovered, when organizing his first Corpus Christi procession, he saw 1 or 2 men with candles in their hands. It is true this practice was the only one the few surviving brothers still observed, but they had kept the faith, and one of them very soon attracted the attention of his curé. The moving story of how this happened was told later by the Abbé Vianney in one of his catechism classes. "We had here in this parish," he said, "a young man who died a few years ago. One day, coming into the church to say his prayers before going out to work in the fields, he left his mattock at the door and lost all thought of himself before God. One of his neighbors, who worked a few fields away and was used to seeing him every morning, started to wonder why he hadn't turned up. Going back to the village, he had the idea of looking into the church in case he was there, and there he was, of course. "What have you been doing there all this time?" he asked him, and the man replied, "I look at God, and he looks at me." He was looking at God, and God was looking at him. That's the key to everything, my children. This silent whisperer, who died in October of 1825, Louis Chaffagnon, for that was his name, had gone to meet his God with the confidence of an absolute faith, a hymn of hope on his lips. Thus, 5 or 6 years, at the most, after the Abbé Vianney's arrival in the parish, sanctity was already to be found there. The curé was determined that the confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament should fulfill a missionary as well as a purely devotional function. He therefore made use of its meetings for the religious instruction of the promising men and youths whom he wanted to turn into leaders and models for his flock. He preached to them the habits of frequent communion, and of family prayers, and of Christian practices of grace at meals, the Angelus, the lifting of the hat to the wayside crucifix, the recitation of the rosary on the way to and from work, and of religious readings. His words struck home. His hearers' faith grew. Their concern over what the neighbors would say vanished. On August 6th, 1823, the Abbé Vianney must have experienced a gentle satisfaction when he was able to take about 2/3 of his parishioners on a pilgrimage to the ancient chapel of Fauveray at Lyons. It was a magnificent day. The pilgrims left the village in procession, singing hymns as they went, and with the resplendent banners given by the Viscount d'Ars at their head. At Trevor they had embarked on 2 great barges, which were drawn by horses, down the Saône to Lyons, and they walked in procession once more to Fauveray, where the Curé d'Ars celebrated Mass, and where a number of the pilgrims received Holy Communion from his hands. There was indeed a real change going on in his flock, and the happy curé, who was, forgivably enough, a little blinded by his affection, could write 3 months later to Claudine Fayot, whom he still called his little mother of Les Noix, "I've got a little parish that's full of religion. Naturally, everything was not perfect for the young people, where many of them, still under the spell of dancing and the desecration of Sunday, had not yet been stopped. But the Jubilee extended to the whole Christian world by Leo XII in 1826, and a mission preached at Ars in the following year, coming in quick succession, resulted in some sensational conversations. Catherine Lassigny has given us a wonderful picture of this mission of 1827 in her Memoir of St. John Vianney. It is impossible to imagine, she writes, the graces of conversion which the curé won by his prayers and above all by the celebration of the Holy Sacrifice. There was a real revolution in the men's hearts. The power of grace was so overwhelming that the few indeed could resist it. Respect for convention was turned upside down. People began to be ashamed of not doing good and of not practicing their religion. You saw men going about with serious expressions, with a thoughtful look on their eyes. You could even hear some of them who had not thought the divine clemency for many a long day, saying unashamedly in the streets, "I've got to go to confession." There was not one of them who was not in a holy disposition. In one of his sermons, the curé pronounced these words to them, "My brothers, ours is no longer ours." It was true. Ours had changed beyond recognition. The phrase was that of a blacksmith, Jean Picard, who came from Montcroux in the Saône-et-Loire, and who had settled down in the village. He had dealings with people there in the past and had visited it on business. So he felt a certain trepidation at making his home there. But when he found himself in the midst of the decent, friendly people that the villagers had become under the Abbé Vianney's influence, surrounded by men and women who took it as a matter of course to go to Mass even on ordinary work days, and who regularly laid down their work even on the minor feast days without their pockets suffering for it. He could hardly believe his eyes. In the old neighbors, which could hardly be taken as a compliment, it was now, added a priest who often visited the village, incomparably superior to all the others. You had a feeling when you entered the village of ours as if the soul of the saint who had transformed its souls were hovering over men and things alike. The first thing that struck us, said Lyon's lawyer, who made the pilgrimage, was the complete restfulness and peace of the surroundings. You seemed to be breathing a milder air. How kindly the inhabitants greeted us! Christian hospitality and brotherly relations came out in everything they did. We noticed that the houses were decorated with statues of the Virgin or with images of the saints. The same visitors who attended High Mass on Sundays and in the Ars Church remarked that the recollection that reigned there was quite extraordinary. Welcomed as eagerly as he was in every home, the Abbé Vianney was indeed the good shepherd who knows all his sheep and whom all his sheep know. No one in his flock could feel neglected. No sooner had a boy or a young man gone into service with a family than the Curé de Ars concerned himself with him, discovered how far his religious instructions had gone, asked that he be sent to the catechism class or to Mass, as the case might be, and insisted that he be treated on an equal footage with the children of the house, since he also had a soul which was precious in the eyes of God. There was nothing in which he did not take an interest, whether it was health or work or crops. He would greet the people with familiarity of a father, and the wife of the mayor, the Countess d'Escarets, observed, would talk to them of their affairs, with which he was as familiar as they were. He shared wholeheartedly in his people's joys and successes, always adding that thanks must be given to God. But also there was no one who could bring consolation as he could in the midst of reserves or revive the failing courage of the broken-hearted. The grace that had transformed the souls of the inhabitants of Ars shone through their features. Many visitors could not get it out of their heads. They said Ars gave them an idea of what the first Christians must have been. Monsignor Convert, who was appointed curé of the parish in July of 1889, exactly 30 years after the death of the saint, had the good fortune to know a great many of those whom the Abbé Vianney had baptized. Married people preached to or taught by his example. Their faces, he wrote, bore an imprint of holiness, which I have rarely seen to such a degree. They had a calm, a serenity, a sort of radiation of heavenly happiness, which would have enabled one to pick them out in no matter how large of a crowd. Chapter 2. The House of Providence. The Providence home at Ars played a very special part in the life of Abbé Vianney. This educational institution, which was born of his charity, and had nothing but his charity to live on, and to it he gave a very great deal of his heart. It will be remembered that when he arrived in the parish, he had found no schools worthy of the name. He set about straightway laying plans for a foundation of 2 schools, to be staffed by masters and mistresses whom he would choose himself. He began with the girls' school, for he knew he would have no difficulty in finding mistresses for it. But he did not find it necessary to have recourse to any teachers' college. 2 good women of the village, Mademoiselle Binouet Lardet and Mademoiselle Catherine Lassigny, seemed to him to possess all the necessary qualifications. In 1823, he sent them to finish their studies at the school run by the Sisters of St. Joseph at Bourg, paying for their board and their teaching himself. For this first school of his, he bought a house facing right on the church square, and it opened at Martinmas in 1824 under the management of Vianney and Catherine. Their curriculum was a simple one, and there was no fees. The mistresses received no pay, but their board and lodging and the satisfaction of knowing they were doing good. The school was successful beyond all expectations. People sent us their children from towns around. We had to turn the garret into a dormitory, and the first year we boarded 16 girls, said Catherine. Without realizing what he was doing, the Abbé Vianney had founded a boarding school. The board also was free, the only obligation on the parents being to supply beds and linens for their children, since the school had not got any of its own. When the fathers and mothers came to see their children, they also brought food with them. But a plan yet more far-reaching was already taking shape in the Abbé Vianney's always active imagination. One Sunday in January 1827, he confided to his parishioners his wish to add to the house a home for orphaned or abandoned girls, for he had run into a number of them in the village round about, and he had found the sight heartbreaking. So the Curé de Ars bought a little plot of land next door to the school. He himself drew up the plans for the building of his dreams. To speed up the job, he took a hand with the workmen, helped dress the stone, mixed the mortar, and carried the planks and the beams. Once the annex had been added, the Abbé Vianney decided only to accept day pupils for the school. Dormitory and refectory were reserved for the children taken in out of charity, and the saint gave the new home the beautiful name of Providence. The number of orphans, for that was the name by which all the boarders came to be known, soon rose to more than 60, for only one qualification was necessary to be sheltered under the roof blessed by God: misfortune or poverty. There was very little scrutiny of age of the candidate. Poor girls of 18 and 20 appeared at the doors of Providence and were admitted. It did not matter that they did not know a word of their catechism, had never made their communion. They were hungry, and they were begging. The Abbé Vianney had a limitless compassion for these abandoned girls. As long as there was a single place free, and self-sacrifice and ingenuity could always make one, even though caution might insist that accommodation had been stretched to the limit. Not a single child was left without shelter. When things became most difficult, the saint was able to breathe into his helpers something of his own heroism. One night, he himself brought to Providence a poor little girl he had met in the street. "Find a place for this child whom God has sent you," he said to Catherine. "But, Monsieur le Curé, there isn't a single bed left." And the Curé de Ars, certain of being listened to, replied, "Surely there's yours." Without a word more, the compassionate woman held out her arms to the orphan. Even babes in arms were saved in this way by the Abbé Vianney. It happened one day that I found a newborn child left in the church porch, a woman working at the orphanage said. The curé told us to take it in and to put it out to wet nurse when we had made some little clothes for it. Another time, when we heard that a woman had suffered terrible misfortune and was dying in a neighboring parish, he sent me with one of my comrades to take charge of her baby, which we then brought up. The Curé de Ars put into his house of Providence all the little money he had come to him from his family. When his inheritance was spent to the last penny, he started selling his furniture and his household goods, and then holding out his hands for alms, and the lady of the manor and benefactors of Lyons came to his aid. The 70 mouths there were to feed meant that 100 bushels of wheat a month were needed. There were hours when disaster seemed at the door, when it appeared as if the only thing to do was to admit it's all up. There's nothing left to go on with. At moments like this, Vianney or Catherine would go and see the curé and ask him how many orphans he thought they could keep on. "But what are you thinking of? "We're keeping them all," he would cry. He would be more anxious than he had appeared, however, and once left to himself he would redouble his prayers and ask God to come to his help with a miracle, and God would answer his appeal. One day in 1829, finding that the wheat destined for the orphans' bread had dwindled to a mere couple of handfuls, he hid a relic of St. Francis Regis in this pitiful remnant of grain. He had made a pilgrimage years before to the tomb of the great missionary at Levelsac, and had obtained of him the grace of being able to continue his studies. Today he asked him for bread for his children. The next day the granary was so full that the staff of the home trembled lest its worm-eaten floor should give way, just as St. Peter's net in the Sea of Galilee was at the point of breaking under the miraculous draught of fishes. But that was not the only wonder that occurred at Providence. One day, when Jean Marie Chenet, who was by turn gardener, cook, washwoman, and baker at the orphanage, mentioned to Catherine that there was not enough flour for 3 loaves, whereas she had to make 10, Catherine replied, without another thought, "If only the curé were to ask God, I believe he would arrange for our remnant of flour to give us a batch." Jean Marie went straight to the Abbé Vianney and told him the position. "You must pray and bake your bread," he told her. "I set to work, though I was still very worried," Jean Marie recounted later. "I started by pouring very little water and flour into a kneading trough, but I saw that my flour was still much too thick. So I added more water and then more flour, but my little reserve was never exhausted. And then I saw the trough was full of dough, just like it was on the days when we put in a great sack into it. We made 10 big loaves, each weighing between 20 and 22 pounds, and we filled the oven as if nothing had happened, to the astonishment of everyone who saw it. We told the curé what had happened, and all he said was, 'God is very good. He looks after the poor.' The Ars Orphanage did an enormous amount of good. I've often heard people telling the curé, Catherine relates, that only on the day of judgment would men realize all the good that had been done by this house. Of the children taken in by the Abbé Vianney, a great number, Catherine goes on, profited admirably by his teaching, by becoming good mothers or good servants, and quite a number of even took their vows as nuns. The curé associated the orphans in his prayers and his sacrifices. At that period, when he was fighting with such determination against the dances, when scandal was wounding his heart most bitterly, the devoted girls asked their mistress for permission to relay each other on their knees all through the night, so as to unite themselves round the clock with the supplications of their beloved parish priest. The Lyons lawyer, who has already been quoted, will give some idea of what sort of training was imparted in this very special kind of boarding school. Its very existence had seemed to him a wonder in itself, and there was no lessening in his admiration when he came to see the working of the curé's favorite institution from close to. Its inmates numbered at this time 50 or 60 girls, coming from every part of the country and admitted without money. They spent an indefinite time at Providence, and were they placed in employment in the surrounding farms. During their stay there, they learned to know, to love, and to serve God before anything else. The range of teaching was not very wide, but the faith, the love of God, and the docility that reigned there were quite wonderful. It was in no sort of sense an ordinary institution. It was rather a veritable emanation of that saintliness of its founder. Its resources, its life, its spirit, and its direction all came from him. It was an institution which bore the imprint of the supernatural, and which could only live through the immediate influence of the outstanding soul who had called it into existence. The education given at Providence was primarily practical. The children who were being brought up there would not live on their investments. So they learned to sew, to knit, to wash, and to iron, and Catherine even taught some of them to spin and to weave. The elementary teachings given was, however, quite adequate. The girls who came out the orphanage could all read, write, and do their sums. They might take some liberties with their spelling, for Catherine herself was no genius at this, but at any rate they knew their catechism thoroughly. An official document which no one will suspect of partiality will speak more eloquently than any flatteries to the value of the work done at the foundation of Saint Jean-Marie Vianney. It is true, the Trevoux primary school inspector wrote in one of his reports that the worthy ladies who are at the head of this institution do not possess a very extensive education, but they have something that can replace knowledge and is worth more than it, goodness. The children who are being trained under their guidance resemble them. For many years the House of Providence was visited every day by its founder, from 1827 on. When the orphanage was sufficiently organized, the Abbé Vianney made it the regular place of his midday meal, which was, incidentally, the only one he ate in the course of the day. There was no one to wait on him at table, however, and no napkin laid for him, just a little earthen pot in the embers of the hearth, where some milk or a little soup was kept warm for him. The curé helped himself, and only sat down if he was too tired to stand. From the kitchen he passed into the courtyard, and then you could see a scene which brought to life again the page of the gospel that portrayed Jesus in the midst of the children. All the games stopped for the minute while the orphans thronged round their adopted father. He knew them all and called them by their Christian names in his gentle voice. It was his only rest, his best recitation. He liked to put questions to the smallest girl, and their simple-minded replies lit up his austere features. It needed hardly be said that comfort and strength the mistresses drew from these daily visits of the curé. The Abbé Vianney allowed some of the orphans to take temporary work in the surrounding farms, but only during the winter. When the children left Providence for the last time, they had no need to worry where to go. The curé had already found them a place. They were only too glad of the opportunity to come back and ask his advice. To those who married he gave a little dowry, a few articles of their trousseau. He spared neither his encouragement nor his prayers for those who felt a vocation to the religious life. He proved his own person the truth of one of his remarks, that the charity of the saints is an overflow from the heart of God.